As the world has gone through a pretty tough time over the past couple of years with the COVID pandemic as well as the ongoing Russia-Ukraine crisis, food shortages are becoming a real problem. But there's also the problem of unsustainable farming, and critics have suggested that sustainable farming could feed people and the planet for the foreseeable future. Today, we're discussing these issues and long-standing systems of sustainable farming. Stay tuned. First up, what exactly is going on? As we mentioned, global food systems are going through a pretty bleak time at the minute, with the Ukraine crisis having a huge impact on the industry. Ukraine and Russia both are big exporters of wheat, rapeseed, corn, and sunflower seeds, and the lack of exports is having a big impact on a lot of countries. Not only this, but the food industry is responsible for huge greenhouse gas emissions, as well as water pollution and the destruction of some species' habitats. When you add these negative impacts on the environment to the vulnerability of the system to other global problems, such as the aforementioned pandemic, as well as climate change and other unforeseen issues, then you begin to see how unsustainable the current model is. But as negative as all this is, there's a potential light at the end of the tunnel, and many big players within the industry are advocating a change to sustainable systems such as agroecology, which incorporates ecological principles to agricultural systems and practices, with the goal of living in harmony with the environment and not completely exploiting it. This approach has long been practiced around the world by indigenous peoples who haven't completely decimated their land, so we know it can work. But the problem is whether or not big farming can be convinced to take a step back to implement these new ideas. It's a nice idea, but it means nothing if the big boys aren't prepared to take the hit. Next, let's take a closer look at the so-called win-win food systems. Stay tuned. As we all know, current food systems tend to have a severe impact on the environment, but this is not the only negative issue with the industry. Around 25% of the planet's population have no idea where their next meal is coming from, which in 2022 is scandalous. Industrial agriculture is also one of the drivers of modern-day colonialism, but agroecology offers a solution to these problems. It allows people and communities to live a healthy lifestyle, while also restoring the ecosystems that provide for them at the same time. The food sovereignty movement incorporates agroecology to its ethical mandate. Its members, including peasants and indigenous communities who are fighting for food to be produced in a way that's culturally appropriate and socially acceptable, are turning it into one of the biggest social movements in the world as people slowly realize the impact of what unsuitable food systems mean for the planet. The movement and the agroecology system that it champions helps more than 200 million farmers in over 70 countries keep their wealth locally and helps them build healthy relationships between themselves and the land. Genetic modification is unavailable to a lot of these indigenous farmers thanks to the patents involved, as well as the high cost of the equipment needed, which has pushed local farmers towards on-farm breeding, as well as implementing local knowledge. What do you make of agroecology? And what about colonizing agroecology? As good as it is for industrial-scale farming beginning to get involved in agroecology, some have criticized the industry for simply appropriating these practices from indigenous communities and rural farmers in poorer nations. For agroecology to be truly successful, it relies on a solid network of local relationships, which some critics have suggested big industry doesn't particularly have. One Amazonian practice known as Chagra is an indigenous agroforestry tradition which has promoted the biodiversity in the region, but is not indistinguishable from the forest itself. These big companies would almost certainly not use practices such as Chagra to promote sustainable farming, as they don't have the local knowledge. And Regenerative Agricultural Alliance CEO Reginaldo Hazlitt Moro-Quinn has suggested it's fundamental for achieving a regenerative outcome to not define it, to not reduce it to our myopic understanding of things, to the limitations of our colonizing minds. Rather, we seek to understand what is and what isn't regenerative. Other critics have pretty much backed up these views by suggesting that sustainable methods such as agroecology are simply ethical rather than technological, and from this point of view, we should be living a more harmonious life with the environment. However, until big industry realizes this, we're simply going round in circles, as they're never going to implement agroecology and other practices like this in the correct way. What do you make of big farming? Next up, we're discussing claims that the UK can reach food self-sufficiency and sustainability. Stay tuned. A recent report in the UK has suggested the small European nation could become sustainable by focusing on things such as grass-fed beef and lamb. Regenerative farming practices such as this could see an end to grain-fed mass animal farming, signaling a return to more sustainable crop rotation policies, which would help restore the land no end. However, this could see a huge reduction in chicken and pork production, as these animals rely on grain for the most part. Grazing livestock is imperative for the sustainable farming industry, and should we see a switch to this, much more beef and lamb could be produced by countries such as the UK. One of the potential drawbacks for reaching self-sufficiency could be the massive reduction of eggs. As we pull back on grain-fed farming, less chickens would be available, which of course means less eggs. However, it would mean that more fruit and veg would be produced, as farmers would have more space to grow with less grain needed as animal feed. This could also mean that UK-grown pulses would double, but some critics have claimed that it would take a lot to convince an entire nation to completely change their diets, no matter how healthy the switch could actually be. While the report has also claimed this sort of change would improve habitats as well as go some way to combat climate change, they would first need to sell the idea to the population. Are you a fan of sustainable farming? Some of these self-sufficiency plans have been attacked now. Stick around. Part of the plan to increase self-sufficiency would see acres of land in the UK as well as the world set aside for greenhouses for produce. And in England, the idea of backing farmers has seen some critics attack the government and label the plan half-baked. The idea is to back farmers with an influx of cash in the UK of around £270 million to be invested in technology to help with productivity and profitability. The government strategy is also supposedly focused on strengthening supply chains, while also boosting the country's own food production, bringing down reliance on other countries and the global food supply chain. The UK government also plans on spending 50% of its public sector food money on local farming, which should also boost the economy. They've said that next year a framework would be published which is designed to help UK farmers grow more food. Critics have said that the policy lacks detail, and Henry Dimbleby, a restaurateur and government advisor, has himself criticized plans, saying they've, the government, now implemented more than 50% of what I recommended, but it hasn't been done with one vision across the whole system. The plan has also drawn criticism from health campaigners who have suggested there should be a tax on unhealthy foods, while conservation charity The Wildlife Trust claimed the governments aren't doing enough to restore nature at scale. What do you make of these so-called plans? And finally, a report has suggested fair trade practices are benefiting poorer farmers, to the shock of absolutely nobody. A recent report entitled Assessing the Impact of Fair Trade on Poverty Reduction and Economic Resilience Through Rural Development has suggested that farmers who are part of a fair trade programs benefited greatly from these initiatives, especially in times of global crisis, i.e. now. One contributor to the report, Tatjana Mathhofer, said, "In times of crisis, it becomes evident that fair trade enhances farmers' economic resilience and supports them in continuing their profession in challenging times. This might seem obvious, but with the introduction of the minimum price and the premium, many farmers have been saved from complete ruin, which in poorer countries is imperative for their survival." Researchers looked at the same organizations 3 times over the past decade to figure out how fair trade practices had changed the conditions they were working in. These organizations, which included 3 banana cooperatives from Peru, were then compared with non-fair trade farmers, and in some cases, the income of the fair trade farmer was up to 50% higher, which completely validates the fair trade initiative. Bravo! What do you guys think of fair trade farming? Pretty cool, right? As always, thanks for dropping by today, and remember to join us again next time for some more fun reveals. And why not like and share today's video with any farmers or fair trade champions you know of, while also subscribing to our channel so you don't miss out on more great bits and pieces in the future. Bye, guys.